Under the rule of the military and President Sisi, Egypt is currently experiencing one of the worst human rights crises in its modern history. Over the last year, UN special procedure experts have repeatedly and urgently warned the international community that the human rights situation in the country continues to deteriorate. At the same time, economic experts have increasingly raised concerns that Egypt is, quote, on the brink of an economic abyss due to corruption, cronyism, and government mismanagement. The Transparency International, who ranks countries based upon perceived corruption, has ranked Egypt 130 in the world, and it has fallen drastically over the last several years in the rankings. Tariq Morsi, a former member of the Egyptian Parliament's Labor Committee, recently said on record, Sisi sponsors and encourages corruption, and that corruption grows and increases as long as the military institutions controls authority. The figures do not lie, but rather clearly declare that the Egyptian state is collapsing under Sisi's rule. The hypothesis proposed by this event today is that the current economic and human rights crisis in Egypt are deeply linked, and in fact, two sides of the same coin. We will attempt to demonstrate how poor governance and policies designed to silence dissent through widespread repression have contributed and are interlinked to the economic troubles facing the country. And we will also describe the human cost of this approach to governance by examining the human rights situation, including the emblematic case of Allah Abdel Fattah. Today, the speakers are Mohamed Lotfy, an Egyptian human rights defender and the co-founder and executive director of the Egyptian Commission for Rights and Freedoms. He will provide an overview of the rights situation in the country. Eberhard Kinley, directeur des recherches au Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. Mr. Kinley is the author of several books, including Egypt, A Fragile Power of 2021. And Sana Saif, a human rights defender, filmmaker, and sister of Allah Abdel Fattah. Mr. Abdel Fattah is currently imprisoned in Egypt under charges of spreading false news for his role as leader in pro-democracy protests in the country. I will not go any further into details at this time. I will only introduce myself. I'm Jeremy Smith, Director of the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, Geneva office. And once again, I thank you for attending this meeting. I will give each speaker 10 minutes, after which I will give the floor to participants, both on and off, in the room and online, for questions and comments. Thank you very much. And with no further ado, let me turn over the floor to Mohamed Lotfy.
Thank you, Jeremy, for the introduction. I am glad to be here. I'm in Geneva to attend this side event, to be at the UN premises. This is a privilege. Most Egyptian human rights defenders and NGO directors have been under travel ban, and for many of them, assets freeze for now over 8 years. And I am keen to relay to you the vibes in Egypt and the developments that we have seen over the past 2 years that lead to this abysmal scenario in which Egypt is under politically, socially, and economically. Egyptian government has been trying to rebrand its image or rehabilitate its image internationally since 2021. In September 2021, the Egyptian government adopted a national strategy for human rights. Despite being a poor document in terms of human rights norms and standards and promises, next to nothing has been achieved in this strategy over a year later. In October 2021, the Egyptian president decided not to renew the state of emergency under which the country was for nationwide over 5-6 years. And the powers provided to the executive and security apparatus were integrated 2 weeks later into ordinary law. In April 2022, the president has called for two things: a national dialogue and the re-establishment or reactivation of a presidential pardons committee. These were all attempts to distract, to divert attention from the crisis of human rights in Egypt, and to choose the grounds on which the Egyptian government can be questioned about human rights. Only in March 2020, Egypt was under the UPR review. There were many significant and important recommendations that some of you have made to the Egyptian government as part of the UPR review, and that the government accepted, but then quickly realized or quickly knew that it could not fulfill any promises around those recommendations, and so chose to divert attention, to divert your attention, and so far effectively, by the way, from the UPR recommendations, which we should be having as a benchmark for measuring progress on human rights, diverting it into a poor national strategy that blames the victims of torture for being tortured because they are not aware of their legal rights. I'm paraphrasing what's in the national strategy. On the death penalty, the national strategy says, well, there should be some academic framework to assess whether abolishing the death penalty can be conducive to a peaceful society, something along those lines. And so we are having a document there that the government takes pride in that's far lower than some even of the recommendations that the National Council for Human Rights in Egypt would make back in 2010 or 2009, only 10-15 years ago. On the Presidential Pardons Committee, we have been engaging as Egyptian NGOs for human rights very actively with this committee, hoping that that could lead to the release of the thousands and thousands of prisoners, political prisoners that are in Egypt. I can tell you that as NGOs of human rights in Egypt, we jointly sent to this Presidential Pardons Committee 4,108 names with the details of those prisoners. These are families or lawyers of families who came to us, submitted a request to us to bring their cases of their loved ones to the Presidential Pardons Committee. Out of the 4,108 submitted between May 2022 and February 2023, just last month, 177 were released. In total, we monitored the releases of 1,441 between January 2022 and March 23. You would think that's a good number. That's progress. But wait a minute. During the same period, 3,212 political prisoners were arrested. So if anything, the figures tell us the number of political prisoners in Egypt have been on the rise in what the government presents as a good year of 2022. So the crisis of human rights in Egypt is deepening as the government tries its best, and unfortunately successfully in many places, to divert attention from the crisis itself. Disappearances have continued. We documented at ECRF over 3,614 cases of disappearances. Death penalty has been, and execution has been, continued to be delivered and executed until this year. To cut it short, the Egyptian government has been capable of duping the international community, buying time year after year, choosing the standards on which basis it makes promises, basis that it doesn't even respect, such as the national strategy or the national dialogue. You'll tell me, well, maybe there is a national dialogue going on now. It didn't even start. And there is no guarantees that will be any meaningful participation from human rights organizations. Maybe that's a good place, Mohamed, that we can discuss difficult topics. Yeah, it's an opportunity, but it's not happening. Egypt hosted the climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27. There is no committee to discuss environment or pollution or climate change within this national dialogue. None. Maybe it's a place to discuss maybe minorities' rights. There is no committee to discuss minorities' rights. Maybe it's a good place to discuss women's rights. Yeah, there is a committee within the national dialogue. It's called Family Cohesion and Social Peace. That's where we suspect women's rights are supposed to be discussed. So even on this basis that the government chooses for itself to show progress, there is no advances. There are no advances happening. Maybe you will think that the repression is only touching upon critical voices, politicians. No, it's generalized. In October, November 2022, over 1,400 ordinary Egyptians were arrested because they were posting online their grievances about the economic situation in Egypt. Inflation, rise of prices, lack of basic commodities. These are acute problems that the Egyptian public is facing, and many of them were calling for protests during COP27. None of those guys were released. None of those 1,400 people were released since October, November last year. And those are ordinary Egyptians who are not politicized and who are fed up with this government, whether it's for their economic performance or for their political repression. So your ordinary Egyptian today has no means to express their grievances, neither through a parliament, through elected parliamentarians, no TV or media, classic media, not social media. Social media, people get arrested, but there's no way for them to have somebody express their views on normal classical media, TV, radio, and press. Journalists who write about corruption, there are journalists from Mada Masr, which is an independent online network outlet, who have written about corruption allegation within the pro-government party, Future of Egypt, and they are now facing trial for spreading false information undermining national security. Anybody who dares to challenge the line the government wants to tell everybody internally or externally is accused of spreading false information undermining national security. Mohamed Al-Baqir, who is an NGO executive director, Adala Center for Rights and Freedoms, who, by the way, is a lawyer of Ala Abdel Fattah, has been serving a 4-year sentence by an emergency court. Just last month, the Egyptian Coordination for Rights and Freedoms, its directors and some of their members, received up to 15 years prison for belonging to a terror group and spreading false information as well. So no prospects for economic reform, progress, well-being, social welfare, poverty on the rise, and repression on the rise. And the only place where the Egyptian government has been successful so far is in duping the international community in forums like this one to buy time. And this is your role to take. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lotfy. I will now turn to Eberhard, who will join us online because of the right of French. No, thank you very much. I will now turn to Eberhard, who is online because of the right of French workers to strike. He was unable to catch his train. But thank you very much for joining us. And he will speak about the interconnections between human rights and the economic situation and give a slight overview of the economic situation. Please go ahead.
Yes, let me just make sure that everybody can hear me. Is that all right? Yes, well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me, and as many apologies for talking to you on a screen and from a distance. Well, as it was already as you were already told, I'm sadly sitting here in Paris in my study and not in the Palais des Nations in Geneva. But I still hope that even though I'm absent physically, that we can still have a lively debate a little longer. So I was asked to talk about the Egyptian economy, and obviously I thought, well, there should be a link should be established between the current economic crisis, possibilities to overcome it, and the human rights situation, which is of course of major concern for us here at this particular meeting. Now, it's obvious, and I need not probably say that once again, but I still want to say it, and I want to, yes, I want to say it. Obviously, I'm perfectly convinced myself that protecting and defending human rights is a necessity in itself and an object, a valuable object in itself. In Egypt and elsewhere. Nonetheless, and that's of course, well, partly because I was asked to talk about the economy, I thought it might be useful also to think about human rights issues as in terms of their impact on the economic situation in Egypt and on possibilities to bring about some, say, positive change for the majority of Egyptians. Now, it's an old argument, of course, that I tried to warm up here, but I think it's still a very topical argument. Some of you may know about academic debates about whether authoritarian government helps or doesn't help economic development. Now, the jury is, of course, as usually out in these academic debates, also because there's a lot of confusion going on between the periods we are talking about. Nonetheless, it seems to me, and that's the argument in a nutshell, that today in Egypt and elsewhere, there is no, basically economic development doesn't stand an ice cream's chance of hell of succeeding if it is being conducted under authoritarian rule, or if authoritarian rule runs economies. So the second part of the argument, and I will probably not have much time to develop that, is that, of course, once we do not have economic development or inclusive and sustainable growth, of course, human rights will again suffer. So it's a vicious circle, yeah. But anyway, just to give you a couple of ideas about the Egyptian economy, perhaps first of all, which probably many of you know as much as I do, and maybe even better, it's all in a sense highlighted and encapsulated by the latest agreement or the latest exchange of letters for a new IMF loan. Not the first one, of course. There has been another one before and yet another one before. And it's basically the third major arrangement under the current government, which, as we all know, came to power in 2014. 2013. So the need for an IMF loan already tells us something about the state of the economy. It is not necessarily a solution that I would advocate in normal times, because as we all know, IMF loans, they come with conditions which are not necessarily favorable for the majority of inhabitants. Nonetheless, we are here in the situation in which Egypt has applied and is receiving another IMF loan of some $3 billion US dollars, which is much less than the Egyptian government intended to obtain, possibly because the IMF has heard some of the grievances that are made in fora like this one here. But another 14 plus billion are needed to somehow balance the books in the short term. Now, this is not a very good situation. We all know that Egypt has been repeatedly in dire straits economically under previous governments as well. So there certainly is a structural issue to that. And there is certainly a side to it which has to do with the limited possibilities that countries in the global south have to develop economically. This is all taken for granted, of course, but nonetheless, the situation has not improved over the years of this particular government, and there is, of course, something that one needs to worry about and wonder about. Now, just to give you a couple of other indications, public debt, as many people know, and that's of course one of the reasons for the grant. Public debt is perhaps manageable, but extremely high. It stands at 88% of GDP roughly in these years. 27% of GDP are external long-term public sector debt, which is difficult in these days, of course, to balance. The government budget this year, 50%, a little bit more than 50% of the current government budget go into debt service and the repayment of public debt, which is enormous if you think what remains ultimately of roughly 112 billion US dollars, what remains for social services, for poverty reduction, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So these are serious issues which have not improved over the years. I could mention a couple of other indicators, of course. We may return to them later on. The current account, of course, is of major concern. The trade balance itself, and investment rate as well, or the investment ratio as well, which is far too low. And obviously we have widespread poverty, which is systematically underestimated by the government, because in fact when we talk about poverty and poverty lines, it's obvious that at least, even if you apply a very generous poverty line, at least two-thirds of the population are poor, and indeed very poor. Now, because time is moving, so just to say, it's a dire situation. It's a dire situation which one doesn't quite know how it will be overcome. It's certainly not the IMF alone that helps to overcome that situation. And I think the only possibility to overcome that situation in the short term, to address this economic crisis, but also in the longer term to create the conditions for something like inclusive and sustainable growth, which the country needs, even though we all may have doubts about the need for additional growth in general. This can only happen if Egyptians may operate in a situation in which human rights are being respected. It is simply impossible to think about economic development these days like in the days of the Aswan High Dam, which in fact was heavily contested as well and has not necessarily been the success story that some people think it was. It was to an extent, yeah, but it's a contested project, and that was possible, of course, in the 1950s and 60s. Yes, it was an infrastructural project. It had its merits, its relative merits. It was centrally planned, but if we talk about economic development today, we're not talking about the new Aswan High Dam, or we're not talking about even the new Suez Canal. We are talking about something else. We are talking about appropriate government support. We can go into this a little later. Appropriate government support in terms of material support, in terms of creating an atmosphere in which innovation is able to prosper and to grow. So we need conditions that allow many actors to be innovative, in economic terms, in intellectual terms, of course, because none of that works without the freedom of expression, the freedom of association, the freedom of thought, the freedom to experiment without some sort of secret service person around the corner who asks you why you do this, that, or the other. It also involves not only liberties, not only the freedom to act, to think, to invent, but it also, of course, involves the attribution and the allocation of resources by government in public budgets, which needs to be transparent. And in order to have the transparent allocation of resources, we need a functioning parliament, which is elected, which represents the electorate, which represents the stakeholders, and not simply the government at the top. So the allocation of resources needs to be unencumbered by the authoritarian allocation of resources, and ultimately by rent seeking of those who are in government, or in Egypt very much in those who run military companies or military related companies. Now, an entire there needs to be first more freedom for people to operate, to invent, and there needs to be another role for government which is supportive of such activities. And in my view, this cannot happen if human rights are being curtailed, reduced as they are at the moment. What one needs ultimately to unleash these forces is debate, deliberation, participation, and obviously the rule of law. And authoritarian government is not well placed to provide any of these measures. So it seems to me, to cut a long story short and to leave some time for debate later on, that the human rights issue is certainly a key issue for development, for economic development, for economic growth. We know that Egypt faces an enormous brain drain. I just recently looked at a figure of how many medical doctors trained and formed in Egypt are leaving the country every year. They're not the only ones. Yeah, if you don't have access to the freedom of thought, if you don't have access to credit, because credit, which is distributed by publicly owned banks, goes largely to friends and family of those who are in power, then obviously there is no reason why one should stay in Egypt and try to be innovative. So all this is related to the authoritarian exercise of power, and it is difficult to see how authoritarianism under present conditions could help economic development or even resolving this economic crisis. Now, some people say, well, yes, look, I mean, now under pressure, this government is again thinking, as previous governments did, of divesting some state-owned assets, companies, and so on and so forth. Well, this is obviously interesting, but the question is not that economic liberalization or privatization is the issue. Authoritarian governments, when they privatize or when they liberalize the economies, they do it as Mubarak has done it before, in an entirely intransparent way. So basically what the government hives off goes to its friends and family, goes to cronies. So the privatization or the economic liberalization of sorts that such governments implement in the past in Egypt, in other countries, but also possibly now, is not the solution. Yeah, the solution is not at all in that area.
Sorry,
now,
Professor Kinley. Sorry,
I'm just coming to my last. I'm just coming to my last sentence.
Thank you.
So I think there is no economic development possible under these conditions, and of course that is something that should be remembered elsewhere in the IMF and so on and so forth. But also, of course, if there is no economic development, the poverty will not improve. The poverty rates will not improve, and of course, with it, human rights in Egypt, be it health, access to health, to education, be it the environment, of course, human rights will continue to suffer. So I think the ultimate issue is, to what extent is it possible to improve the economic situation under authoritarian conditions? And I'm very skeptical about that.
And Sana has been at the United Nations this week. She has spoken before the Human Rights Council, and she will she has spoken to many various ambassadors and diplomats in the room and outside of the room. So Sana, please.
Thank you for having me. 4 months ago, my brother had a near-death experience after over 200 days of what started as a partial hunger strike and then escalated to a full food and water strike. The day before Ala collapsed, a prosecutor came to visit him in prison. It was the first time someone was there to hear him out. We have torture complaints since 2019 that are still being processed. Anyway, Ale relayed his main demands to the prosecutor. He said, I want a consular visit. I'm a British citizen. I deserve a visit. I deserve to meet my embassy. I need access to my lawyers, both British and Egyptian lawyers. The prosecutor seemed cooperative. He put everything on record. It was the first time there seemed to be an acknowledgement of Ala's hunger strike. And the next day, 11th of November last year, Ale fell unconscious in the shower. He woke up on the floor in his cell, found himself surrounded by people, guards, doctors, and his cellmates. His head was cradled by one of his cellmates, and there was a cannula in his body, which gave him a lactate solution and glucose. And then they gave him electrolyte fluid and a spoonful of honey and a pickle. And Ale was back to life. Ale woke up terrified from how close he was to death. He thought about us, about a recent letter he got saying that my sister is pregnant. He thought about the friendly prosecutor. He knew he must be fearlessly campaigning for him outside, so he allowed himself some hope. And he decided to suspend his hunger strike temporarily. In our visits, in my visits with him recently, we agreed on a date for him to go back on hunger strike, a date that makes sense to us as a family. In the outside world, while this was happening to Ale, there were very strong, heartwarming acts of solidarity happening that poured from COP27, the UN Climate Conference in Egypt. Solidarity with Ale and also with all of those unjustly detained in Egypt. This powerful solidarity made world leaders pay attention to our plea to free Ale. And so we, the family, also allowed ourselves some hope. After we saw world leaders going on record saying that they called for Ale's release, we allowed ourselves some hope. We desperately needed a break, so we played along. It's always the politicians' advice to stay quiet, and we did. We stayed silent for 4 months, and very little has happened in those 4 months. During those 4 months, my brother's health recovered a lot, thankfully. He was allowed music and allowed to watch football matches, the semifinals and finals of the World Cup. Visits still happen behind the glass shield, so we still can't hug him. Ala's son is on the spectrum. He's 12, he has autism, he's nonverbal, so he can't communicate with his father through a phone speaker behind the glass shield. So Ala has not seen his son for years. And still no consular visit, and still the Egyptian authorities refuse to acknowledge Ala's British citizenship. Also, the journalist Ahmed Faiz was arrested after he leaked news that Ale was put on drips. I would like to also remind you that Ale's lawyer, Mohamed Lotfy, is in prison. He's facing much worse conditions than Ale. He was arrested after going to the prosecution to represent Ale as a lawyer. He was arrested and then he was put on the same case. So that's the situation. But in Egypt, there is talk about an opening. The national dialogue will start. They've been saying for a year it will start. The new human rights strategy. Delegations here come to talk about structural reforms. There is this talk about something good coming. I'm not saying these attempts are just a sham. They are a sham, but still I see some significance in them. These claims mean that pressure is working. Parts of the Egyptian system is starting to realize that this way of governance is not very sustainable. But there is no political will to implement even these cosmetic reforms. That's why we need you to maintain the pressure. We need you to raise the temperature. We need you when you meet your Egyptian counterparts, when you hear about the national dialogue or any of that, to take that as a signal that you need to press harder because it's working. 2 years ago was the last time this council made action addressing the human rights crisis in Egypt. It was a statement. And afterwards, there were some releases. Of course, it's not only thanks to the statement, it was a number of things together. One of these releases was my cellmate, Aya Kamel, at the time. She was released and Aya was rearrested. She's now in prison. But Aya had a theory. She would tell me, she had a theory about me. She would tell me, I feel like Sanae, they arrest you only to leave you, to let you go. You're a profile that looks good when it gets released. And I've been arrested and released 3 times. What I want to say is that pressure works and we need it. We need you to keep the pressure. Public pressure complements whatever is happening behind in the dark. And the next year is going to be very critical for Egypt because of the economic crisis. We expect more oppression. So if pressure is not maintained internationally, then the situation will even get much worse. Our country is on the verge of instability to the extent that even opposition is willing to cooperate with the regime. Even opposition from inside prisons are willing to cooperate with the regime because we are all scared this time of instability. It's not going to be a lovely Arab Spring. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sana, for that powerful testimony.
One element that of cosmetic reforms that I did not speak of were the inauguration of new prisons last year and the year before. Huge prison complexes with a nice PR from the Egyptian government. The conditions are very, very dire in Badr prison, one of the new prisons on the outskirts of Cairo. Detainees or political detainees are not able to see their lawyers, meet with them in person. Video conferencing is the way to separate them intentionally and make sure that they are not able to tell about the torture and ill treatment that prisoners there are facing. Only a couple of days ago, finally, after a few weeks, one of the prisoners, many of the prisoners, told through video conference their lawyers at the renewal of detention sessions that they were tortured and that they have lack of food, that they are completely banned from family visits, and that many of the prisoners in Badr 3 prison have attempted suicide. And so this is another element that the government tried to embellish its image, to, push away any criticism around conditions of detention. But it is not the case because it's policy. Regardless of the outside look of the prison and the inside facilities and capabilities of the prisons, if the decision of the national security officer is that this person will be denied medical care, you can have the best hospital inside of the prison and still deny the prisoner medical care. And therefore, it is a matter of will to respect human rights and the rights of prisoners. Thank you.
I see now that we do have a question online. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Jennifer Holleis. I'm covering this issue for Deutsche Welle, Germany's international broadcaster in Berlin. My question goes to Sana. I would like to follow up on the date that you agreed with Allah when he would like to return, or when he would return to the hunger strike. And I also heard that you are calling on international or European governments, including Germany, to uphold the pressure. Is there anything specific that you have in mind?
Hi. I would like to keep the date private for now. We have related to both Egyptian, British authorities, and so we do relate, but I would like to keep it private. It has nothing to do with tactics or politics. It really has to do with what makes sense for us as a family. My sister will have a baby soon, and that's not a great time to have a desperate situation like Ale. There are specific asks, like the next session of this council, a statement can be made. But this is my recommendation. At the end of the day, I think politicians know their work best, and they know the tools at their disposal. I particularly urge the German government, because we've seen, well, the German government have been bolder than others in publicity. The Germans were the first. The German MFA made a statement about the sentencing, Alaa's sentencing, saying that because there was no due process, because it was an emergency court. I also remember that Chancellor Scholz was the first leader to tweet, to publicly say that he raised the case. We knew that they were raising the case, but nobody was saying it publicly, putting it on record. And that I appreciate very much. So I would, I'm particularly urging the German government, because I expect them to do more, but also because, well, Germany has a very bad legacy with us because of the arms sales. For 3 years in a row, Egypt was the #1 purchaser of weapons from Germany, and these are insane arms sales that we really can't afford. And we've seen now the collapse, that we couldn't afford these, and they're not supposed to be, like, that's not the priority of what we needed in Egypt. These arms sales happened with previous governments, so I make my urges with no hard feelings, but I just would like you to remember that somehow, well, Germany has benefited from our economic crisis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if I might also then, in lieu of answering your question as well, Jennifer, Sana and a group of NGOs, well before this council session began, this Human Rights Council session began, also communicated to the leaders of multiple countries, including Germany and the United Kingdom and others, the need for states to demonstrate leadership on Egypt at the United Nations Human Rights Council, to bring countries together to speak out on the situation, and or to create a resolution that would create an investigation or a monitoring mechanism into the case of Allah, but not only of Allah's case, but into the case of the tens of thousands of people rotting in prison in Egypt due to unfair trials, and of course the larger context of systematic and widespread brutal repression. And so I think the ask from civil society and Sana is very clear, and we hope that that call resonates.
I'd like to add something. I'm not trying to single out Germany here. It's just because you're a German journalist. I would like to relate that, because, well, you also have like crazy arms sales for France, and I mean, this is a situation in many countries in Europe, so I'm not singling out Germany. I'm actually hoping for more from the current government in Germany.
Thank you very much for the question. If there are no... yes, please.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to all of us, to all of you, all of us, for this presentation today. What we have heard is indeed very concerning, and we also spoke bilaterally yesterday, and you know that we take this very seriously. Germany remains very concerned about the human rights situation in Egypt, and we address these concerns in various formats. COP27 is only one recent example. As you know, we are also vocal here in the Human Rights Council regularly. And well, having said this, we all, I guess, are well aware that when it comes to initiatives in the Council, this is in general not a one-country decision, right? But it's based on broad support. And I can therefore only encourage all of you to take a look and consider or take statements at the Human Rights Council that we can see as indicators for your assessment of the human rights situation in Egypt. And that's all I can say for now. So just, something I wanted to underline from our point of view.
Thank you. And I'm adding my voice to yours, and I'm urging the other countries. And let me just say that the political will come sooner or later. It will probably come when it's too late. Egypt is a crisis in the making, so let's just try and save it. There is a chance to save Egypt, and it's no longer about me or my brother, or even if you don't care about the people, it's going to be very soon about stability in the region. So we don't have to wait for the crisis to erupt so that we address it. Thank you. I really appreciate the efforts you do here in the Council and elsewhere.
Jennifer, did you raise your hand once again?
Yes, I did.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving me the platform to speak again. One last question. Could you tell us a bit more about Allah's state of mind at the moment? How is he doing?
He's intact, I guess. Physically, he's been getting treatment until February. We don't know what, but they were doing a lot of tests and giving him medication. Psychologically, well, we're all excited for the baby coming, and music has helped. But he's not very hopeful. He thinks that if there is no consular access, then what will happen is that they will probably just find ways to renew his sentence. Ale is sentenced to 5 years if he was arrested in 2019. So this should end in 2024, but his release date is 2027 because they decided not to count in the 2.5 years in pretrial detention. So yeah, he's not hopeful, but he's decided to be in a good place because he really respects and is happy and proud of how his campaign is reaching people. And that gave him reason to want to live, that we're fighting back for once. There is a price. And also on a personal level, we're all really excited that my sister is having a baby. So, but he will become impatient with time, I know. Also, I told him, he wanted to go back on hunger strike earlier, and I just told him that I'm too tired. I was burnt out. I needed a break to ramp up the campaign again, and so he chose to be in a better place to give me that space.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions or comments from the floor? Yes, please.
Is it good? Thank you. أعتقد إن المنصة معظمها مصريين، فأستأذنكم إن أنا هتكلم لغة عربية كجامع لينا يعني. أنا مقيم في مصر، فكنت حابب أسألكم عن حاجة وأعتقد إن أنتم هيكون ليكم رؤية فيها. لما أطلق الحوار الوطني في أبريل 2022 يعني شهدنا بعض التحركات التي قد تكون إيجابية، يعني عودة عمرو حمزاوي على سبيل المثال، عودة المهندس ممدوح حمزة من فترة صغيرة وعودته إلى عمله في جامعة قناة السويس. كمان وجود بعض المعارضين في اللي بيحضروا جلسات الحوار الوطني بشكل مستمر. فأعتقد إن دي ممكن تكون يعني ستيب فورورد أو يعني خطوة للأمام، فيهمني أسمع رأي حضراتكم فيها. شكرا.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking at the time. We have 5 minutes left in the event. And in fact, we have to sort of start wrapping it up almost immediately. But do please respond.
Okay. Lotfy, would you like to also? أنا أوكي أرد عليك بالعربي ولا؟ زي ما تحب. I will say it in both languages. The gentleman is asking me about my opinion about the national dialogue and these positive steps. خليني أرد بالعربي الأول وكمان برضو بالإنجليزي. أنا بس ترجمت سؤالك. أنا في كلمتي جبت سيرة التحركات دي. بص أنا بصراحة شايفة هو إيجابي إن في أي حد بيتكلم على إنه محتاجين انفراج. بس انا مش هقدر اقول، انا مش هعمل زي الناس اللي بتقول ان في انفراجه قادمه، لانه انا مش شايفه مؤشرات انفراج، شايفه مؤشرات ناس بتشاور عقلها، لكن مش شايفه اي اكشن حقيقي بيقول ان في انفراج. انا مقدره ومحترمه جدا انه في حد جوه بيشاور عقله في انفراجه، ونتمنى انها تحصل، ولو حصلت هنشجعها. لكن طول ما فيش على الارض حاجات ملموسة بتقول إنه ده توجه، ده قرار، للأسف يعني ببص لها يعني بتعامل مع الحاجات دي بحذر. أنا حاولت أتواصل مع الناس اللي في الحوار الوطني عشان موضوع أخويا. يعني أي مؤشرات إيجابية إحنا طبعا معاها، بس هي للأسف حتى الآن كلها كلام. طبعا في كام حد خرج، في كام حد رجع البلد، بس عددهم بالنسبة للناس اللي بتتحبس وبالنسبة للناس اللي خرجت واتحبست تاني ما يقولش ان دي انفراج للأسف. بس نتمنى انه الجزء اللي بيحاول يبقى فيه إرادة سياسية لأنه فعلا نشوف انفراج، لأنه البلد محتاجاها وفي أزمة اقتصادية هتاكلنا كلنا. ده رأيي يعني.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to end this. We will have to leave now. I wanted to apologize to anyone who wasn't able to make a final statement. Unfortunately, the time has run out. But let me first thank everyone for coming. I know your schedules and I know how busy everyone is, and it's deeply appreciated that you made time today. And we look forward to discussing this further with delegations and others in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you.